Law 3. Conceal your intentions. Keep people off balance and in the dark by never revealing the purpose behind your actions. If they have no clue what you're up to, they cannot prepare a defense. Guide them for enough down the wrong path, envelope them in enough smoke, and by the time they realize your intentions, it will be too late. Part 1. Use decoy objects of desire and red herrings to throw people off the scent. If at any point in the deception you practice people have the slightest suspicion as to your intentions, all is lost. Do not give them the chance to sense what you're up to. Throw them off the scent by dragging red herrings across the path. Use false sincerity, send ambiguous signals, set up misleading objects of desire unable to distinguish the genuine from the false. They cannot pick out your real goal. Transgression of the law. Over several weeks, Nignon de L'Enclos, the most infamous courtesan of 17th century France, listened patiently as the Marquis de Savigny explained his struggles in pursuing a beautiful but difficult young countess. Nignon was 62 at the time and more than experienced in matters of love. The Marquis was a lad of 22, handsome, dashing, but hopelessly inexperienced in romance. At first, Nignon was amused to hear the Marquis talks about his mistakes, but finally she had enough. Unable to bear ineptitude in any realm, least of all in seducing a woman, she decided to take the young man under her wing. First, he had to understand that this was war and that the beautiful countess was a citadel to which he had to lay siege as carefully as any general. Every step had to be planned and executed with the utmost attention to detail and no one's. Instructing the Marquis to start over, Nignon told him to approach the countess with a bit of distance, an air of nonchalance. The next time the two were alone together, she said, he would confide in the countess as would a friend but not a potential lover. This was to throw her off the scent. The countess was no longer to take his interest in for granted. Perhaps he was only interested in friendship. Nignon planned ahead. Once the countess was confused, it would be time to make her jealous. At the next encounter at a major fete in Paris, the Marquis would show up with a beautiful young woman at his side. This beautiful young woman had equally beautiful friends, so that wherever the countess would see the Marquis, he would be surrounded by the most stunning young women in Paris. Not only the countess be seething with jealousy, she would come to see the Marquis as someone who was desired by others. It was hard for Nignon to make the Marquis understand, but she patiently explained that a woman who is interested in a man wants to see that the other women are interested in him too. Only does that give him instant value. It makes all the more satisfying to snatch him from their clutches. Once the countess was jealous but intrigued, it would be time to beguile her. On Nignon's instructions, the Marquis would fail to show up at affairs where the countess expected to see him. Then suddenly, he would appear at salons he had never frequented before, but the countess attended often. She would be unable to predict his moves. All his would push her into a state of emotional confusion, that a prerequisite for successful seduction. These moves were executed and took several weeks. Nignon monitored the Marquess' progress. Through her network of spies, she heard how the countess would laugh a little harder at his witticisms, listen more closely to his stories. She heard that the countess was suddenly asking questions about him. Her friends told her that as a social affair, the countess would often look up at the Marquis. Following his steps, Nignon felt certain that the young woman was falling under his spell. It was a matter of weeks now, maybe a month or two, but if all went smoothly, the citadel would fall. A few days later, the Marquess was at the Countess' home. They were alone. Suddenly, he was a different man. this time acting on his own impulse rather than following Nignon's instructions. He took the Countess's hand and told her he was in love with her. The young woman seemed confused, a reaction he did not expect. She became polite, then excused herself. For the rest of the evening, she avoided his eyes, was not there to say good night to him. The next few times he visited, he was told she was not at home. When she finally admitted him again, two felt awkward and uncomfortable with each other. The spell was broken. Interpretation. Mignon de L'Enclos knew everything about the art of love. The greatest writers, thinkers, and politicians of the time had been lovers, men like Rochefoucauld, Molière, and Richelieu. Seduction was a game to her to be practiced with skill. As she got older and her reputation grew, the most important families in France would send their sons to her to be instructed in matters of love. Nignon knew that men and women are very different, but when it comes to seduction, they feel the same. Deep down inside, they often sense when they are being seduced, but they give in because they enjoy the feeling of being led along. It is a pleasure to let go and to allow the other person to detour you into a strange county or country. Everything in seduction, however, depends on suggestions. You cannot announce your intention or reveal them directly in words. Instead, you must throw your targets off the scent. To surrender to your guidance, they must be appropriately confused. You have to scramble your signals, appear interested in another man or woman, the decoy, then hint at being interested in target, then feign indifference, on and on. Such patterns not only confuse, they excite. Imagine this story from the Countess's perspective after a few of Marquez moves. She sensed the Marquez was playing some sort of the game, but the game delighted her. She did not know where he was leading her, but so much the better. His moves intrigued her, each of them keeping her waiting for the next one. She even enjoyed her jealousy and confusion, for sometimes an emotion is better than the boredom of security. Perhaps the Marquess had ulterior motives, most men do, but she was willing to wait and see, and probably if she had been made wait long enough, what he was up to would not have mattered. The moment the Marquess uttered the fatal word love, however, all was changed. This was no longer a game with moves, it was an artless show of passion. He had gone in a new light. All that before he had charming now seemed ugly and conniving. The countess felt embarrassed and used. A door closed that would never open again. Do not be held a cheat, even though it is impossible to live together without being one. Let your greatest cunning lie in covering up what looks like cunning. By Balthazar Gracian. Observance of the law. In 1850, the young Otto von Bismarck, then a 35-year-old deputy in the Prussian parliament, was a turning point in his career. The issues of the day were the unification of many states, including Prussia, into which Germany was then divided, and a war against Austria, the powerful neighbor to the south that hoped to keep the German weak and at odds, even threatening to intervene if they tried to unite. Prince William, next in line to Prussia's king, was in favor of going to war, and the parliament rallied to the cause, prepared to back any mobilization of troops. The only ones to oppose the war were the present king, Frederick William IV, and his ministers, who preferred to appease the powerful Austrians. Throughout his career, Bismarck had been a loyal, even passionate supporter of Prussian might and power. He dreamed of German unification, of going to war against Austria and humiliating the country that for so long had kept Germany divided. A former soldier, he saw a warfare as a glorious business. This, after all, was the man who years later would say, the great question of the time will be divided not by the speeches and resolutions, but by iron and blood. Passionate patriot and lover of military glory, Bismarck nevertheless had a speech in Parliament at the height of the war fever that astonished all who heard it. Woe unto the statements, he said, who makes war without a reason that will still be valid when the war is over. After the war, you will all look differently at these questions. Will you then have the courage to turn the peasant, contemplating the ashes of his farm, to the man who had been crippled, to the father who had lost his children? Not only did Bismarck go on talk of the madness of this war, but strangest of all, he praised Austria and defended her actions. This went against everything he had stood for. The consequences were immediate. Bismarck was against the war. What could this possible mean? Other deputies were confused and several of them changed their voices or their votes. Eventually the king and his ministers won out and the war was averted. A few weeks after Bismarck's infamous speech, the king, grateful that he had spoken for peace, made him a cabinet minister. A few years later, he became the Prussian premier. In this role, he eventually led his country and a peace-loving king into a war against Austria, crushing the former empire and establishing a mighty German state with Prussia as its head. Interpretation. At the time of the speech in 1850, Bismarck made several calculations. First, he sensed that the Prussian military, which had not kept pace with the European armies, was unready for war. That Austria, in fact, might very well win, a disastrous result for the future. Second, if the war were lost and Bismarck had supported it, his career would be gravely jeopardized. The king and his conservative ministers wanted peace. Bismarck wanted power. The answer was to throw people off the scent by supporting a cause he detested, saying things he would laugh at it if it's said by another. A whole country was fooled. It was because Bismarck's speech that the king made him a minister, a position from which he quickly rose to be the prime minister, attaining the power to strengthen the Prussian military and accomplish what he had wanted all along, the humiliation of Austria and the unification of Germany under Prussia's leadership. Bismarck was certainly one of the cleverest statesmen who ever lived, a master of strategy and deception. No one suspected that he was up to in this case. Had he announced his real intentions, arguing that it was better to wait now and fight later, he would not have won the argument since most Prussians wanted war at that moment and mistakenly believed that their army was superior to the Austrian. Had he played up the king asking to be made a minister in exchange for supporting peace, he would not have succeeded either. The king would have disturbed his ambition and doubted his sincerity. By doing completely insincere and sending misleading signals, however, he deceived everyone, concealed his purpose, and attained everything he wanted. Such is the power of hiding your intentions. Keys to power. Most people are open books. They say what they feel, blurt out their opinions at every opportunity, and constantly reveal their plans and intentions. They do this for several reasons. First, it is easy and natural to always want to talk about one's feelings and plans for the future. It takes effort to control your tongue and monitor what you reveal. Second, many believe that by being honest and open, they are winning people's heart and showing their good nature. They are great. They are greatly deluded. Honesty is actually a blunt instrument which bloodies more than it cuts. Your honesties like to offend people. It is much more prudent to tailor your words, telling people that they want to hear rather than the coarse and the ugly truth of what you feel or think. More importantly, by being unabashed, open to make yourself so predictable and familiar, what is almost impossible to respect or fear you, and power will accrue to a person who cannot inspire such emotions. If you yearn for power, quickly lay honesty aside and train yourself the art of concealing your intentions. Master the art, and you will always have the power hand or the upper hand. Basic to an ability to conceal one's intention is simple truth about human nature. Our first instinct is to apply trust appearances. We cannot go around doubting the reality of what we see and hear. Constantly imagining the appearances concealed something else would exhaust and terrify us. This fact makes it relatively easy to conceal one's intention. Simply dangle an object you seem to desire, a goal you seem to aim for in front of people's eyes, and they will take the appearance for reality. Once their eyes focus on the decoy, they will fail to notice what you're really up to. In seduction, set up conflicting signals such as desire and indifference, and you not only throw them off the scent, you inflame their desire to possess you. A tactic that is often effective in setting up a red herring is to appear to support an idea or cause that is actually contrary to your sentiments. Bismarck used this great effects in his speech in 1850. Most people will believe you have experienced a great change of heart, since it is unusual to believe that you have experienced a change of heart. Most people will believe you have experienced a change of heart since it is so unusual to play so lightly with something as emotional as one's opinions and values. The same applies for any decoyed object of desire. Seem to want something in which you are actually not all interested, and your enemies will be thrown off the scent, making all kinds of errors in their calculations. During the War of the Spanish Succession in 1711, the Duke of Marlborough, head of the English army, wanted to destroy a key French fort because it protected a vital thoroughfare into France. Yet he knew that if he destroyed it, the French would realize what he wanted. To advance down that road, instead, he merely captured the fort and garrisoned it with some of his troops, making it appear as if he wanted it for some purpose of his own. The French attacked the fort, and the Duke let them recapture it. Once they had it back, though they destroyed it, figuring that the Duke had wanted it for some important reasons. Now the fort was gone, the road was unprotected, and Marlborough could easily march into France. Use this tactic in the following manner. Hide your intention not by closing up with the risk of appearing secretive and people making suspicious, but by talking endlessly about your desire and goals, not just your real ones. You will kill three birds with one stone. You appear friendly, open, and trusting. You conceal your intention, and you send your rivals on time-consuming wild goose chases. Another powerful tool in throwing people off the scent is false sincerity. People easily mistake sincerity for honesty. Remember, their first instinct is to trust appearances, and since they value honesty and want to believe in honesty of those around them, they will rarely doubt you or see through your act. Seeming to believe what you say gives your words great weight. This is how Iago deceived and destroyed Othello. Given the depth of his emotion, the apparent sincerity of his concern about Desdemona's supposed infidelity, how could Othello distrust him? This is also how the great con artist Yellow Kid Whale pulled the wool over suckers' eyes. Seeming to believe so deeply in the decoyed object, he was dangling in front of them a phony stock, a touted racehorse. He made it he made its reality hard to doubt. It is important, of course, not to go too far in this area. Sincerity is a tricky tool. appear over-passionate, and you raise your suspicions. Be measured and believable at your ruse will seem that put on that it is. To make your false sincerity an effective weapon in concealing your intentions, espouse a belief in honesty and forthrightness as an important social values. Do this as a publicly as possible. Emphasize your position in this subject by occasionally divulging some heartfelt thought, though only one that is actually meaningless or irrelevant, of course. Napoleon's minister Talleyrand was a master of taking people into his confidence by revealing some apparent secret. This feigned confidence, a decoy, would then elicit a real confidence on the other person's part. Remember, the best deceivers do everything they can do to cloak their roguish qualities. They cultivate an air of honesty in one area to distinguish their dishonesty in others. Honesty is merely another decoy in their arsenal of weapons. 2. Use smoke screens to disguise your actions. Deception is always the best strategy, but the best deceptions require a screen of smoke to distract people's attention from their real purpose. The bland exterior, like the unreadable poker face, this is often the perfect smoke screen, hiding your intentions behind the comfortable and familiar. If you lead the sucker down a familiar path, he won't catch on when you lead him into the trap. In 1910, a Mr. Sam Giesel of Chicago sold his warehouse business for close to $1 million. He settled down to semi-retirement and managing one of his properties, but deep inside he itched for the old days of deal making. One day, a man named Joseph Whale visited his office, wanted to buy an apartment he had up for sale. Kiesel explained the terms. The price was $8,000, but he only required a down payment of $2,000. Wales said he would sleep on it, but he came back to the following day and offered to pay the full $8,000 in cash. If Giesel would wait a couple of days until a deal Whale was working on came through. Even in a semi-retirement, a clever businessman like Giesel was curious as to how Wheel would be able to come up with so much cash, roughly $150,000 per day, so quickly. Well, a whale seemed reluctant to say and quickly changed the subject, but Giesel was persistent. Finally, after assurances of confidentiality, Whale told Giesel the following story. Whale's uncle was the secretary to the coterie of multimillionaire financiers. These wealthy gentlemen had purchased a hunting lodge in Michigan 10 years ago at a cheap price. They had not used the lodge for a few years, so they had decided to sell it and had asked Whale's uncle to get whatever he could for it. For reasons, good reasons, of his uncle, the uncle had been nursing a grudge against the millionaires for years. This was his chance to get back at them. He would sell the property for $35,000 to set up the man whom it was Whale's job to find. The financiers were too wealthy to worry about this low price. The setup would then turn around and sell the property again for its real price, around $155,000. The uncle, Whale, and the third man would split the profits from this second sale. It was all legal and for a good cause, the uncle's good retribution. Kiesel had heard enough. He wanted to be the setup buyer. Whale was reluctant to involve him, but Kiesel would not back down. The idea of a large profit plus a little adventure had him champing at the bit. Whale explained that Kiesel would have to put up a $35,000 in cash to bring the deal off. Kiesel, a millionaire, said he would get the money with a snap of his fingers. Whale finally relented and agreed to arrange a meeting between the uncle, Kiesel, and the financiers in the town of Galesburg, Illinois. On a train ride to Galesburg, Giesel met the uncle, an impressive man with whom he avidly discussed business. Whale also brought along a companion, a somewhat paunchy man named George Gross. Whale explained to Gizzle that he himself was a boxing trainer, that Gross was one of the promising prize fighters he trained, and that he had asked Gross to come along to make the fighter stayed in shape. For a promising fighter, Gross was unimpressive looking. He had gray hair and a beer belly. But But Gizzle was so excited about the deal that he didn't really think about the man's flabby appearance. Once in Galesburg, Whale and his uncle went to fetch the financiers while Gizzle waited in a hotel with Gross, who promptly put on his boxing trunks. As Gizzle half watched, Gross began to shadow box. Distracted as he was, Gizzle ignored how badly the boxer wheezed after a few minutes of exercise, although his style seemed real enough. An hour later, Whale and his uncle reappeared with the financiers, an impressive, intimidating group of men, all wearing fancy suits. The meeting went well, and the financiers agreed to sell the lodge to Gizzle, who had already had the $35,000 wired to a local bank. This minor business now settled, the financiers sat back in their chairs and began to banter about the high finance, throwing out the name J.P. Morgan as if they knew the man. Finally, one of them noticed the boxer in the corner of the room. Whale explained what he was doing there. The financier countered that he too had a boxer in this entourage, whom he named. Whale laughed brazenly and explained that this man could easily knock out their man. Conversation escalated into argument. In the heat of passion, Whale challenged the man to a bet. The financier eagerly agreed and left to get their man ready for a fight the next day. As soon as they had left, the uncle yelled at Whale in front of Gizzle. They did not have enough money to bet with, and once the financiers discovered this, and the uncle would be fired. Whale apologized for getting him into this mess, but he had a plan. He knew the other boxer well, and with a little bribe, they could fix the fight. But where would the money come from the bet? The uncle replied. Without it, they were as good as dead. Finally, Gizzle had heard enough. Unwilling to jeopardize his deal with any ill will, he offered his own $35,000 cash for the part of the bet. Even if he lost that, he would wire for more money and still make a profit on the sale of the lodge. The uncle and the nephew thanked him. With their own $15,000 and Gizzle's $35,000, they would manage to have enough for the bet. That evening, as Gizzle watched the two boxers rehearse the fix in the hotel room, his mind reeled at the killing he was going to make from both the boxing match and the sale of the lodge. The fight took place in a gym the next day. Whale handled the cash, which was placed for security in a locked box. Everything was proceeding as planned in the hotel. The financier were looking glum at how badly their fighter was doing, and Gizzle was dreaming about easy money he was about to make. Then suddenly, a wild swing from the financier's fighter hit Gross hard in the face, knocking him down. When he hit the canvas, blood spurted from his mouth. He coughed, then lay still. One of the financiers, a former doctor, checked his pulse. He was dead. The millionaires panicked. Everyone had to get out before the police arrived. They could all be charged with murder. Terrified, Gizzle hightailed it out the gym and back to Chicago, leaving behind his $35,000, which was only too glad to forget, for it seemed a small price to pay to avoid this implicated in a crime. He never wanted to see Whale or any others again. After Gizzle scurried out, Gross stood up under his own stem. The blood that had spurted from his mouth came from a bowl filled with chicken blood and hot water that he had hidden in his cheek. The whole affair had been masterminded by Whale. Better known as the Yellow Kid, one of the most creative con artists in history. Whale split the $35,000 with the financiers and the boxers, all fellow con artists. A nice little profit for a new day's work. Keys to power. If you believe that deceivers are colorful folk who mislead with elaborate lies and tall tales, you are greatly mistaken. The best deceivers utilize a bland and unconspicuous front that calls no attention to themselves. They know that extravagant words and gestures immediately raise suspicions. Instead, they envelope their mark in familiar, the banal, the harmless. In Yellow Kid, Yale's whale stealing with Sam Gizzle, the familiar was a business deal. In the utopian case, it was Selasi's misleading obsequiousness, exactly what Balcha would have expected from a weaker warlord. Once you have lulled your stalker's attention with familiar, they will not notice the deception being perpetrated behind their backs. This derives from a simple truth. People can only focus on one thing at a time. It is really too difficult for them to imagine that the bland and harmless person they are dealing with is simultaneously setting up something else. The grayer and more uniform the smoke in your smoke screen, the better it conceals your intention. In the decoy and the red herring devices discussed in part 1, you actively distract people in the smoke screen. You lull your victims, drawing them into your web because it is so hypnotic. That is often the best way of concealing your intention. The simplest form of smoke screen is facial expression. Behind the bland, unreadable exterior, all sort of mayhem can be planned without detection. This is a weapon that the most powerful men in history have learned to perfect. It was said that no one could read Franklin Roosevelt's face. Barcon James Rothschild made a lifelong practice of disguising his real thoughts behind bland smiles and nondescript looks. Never was a face less of a barometer.